This is the SSE Diverse Careers Workshop. We're going from 1 to around 5:15. Here's the schedule. Lenny Tettleman, who's here. Lenny's over there. He's going to give an introduction in a sec. I am going to talk you through some career exploration strategies. Then Sarah and Audrey, who are sitting right there, will talk about example career paths. Around 3:30, we're going to have a break. We're going to come back, and Eric Perkins is going to talk a little bit about effective networking. I think it's going to be really interesting. And then Judy, who's right here, is going to introduce our panelists. And then, so there's some training at the beginning. We're going to talk about careers. We're going to talk about how you explore and identify careers for you. And then there are 8 panelists. And you can see we have a diverse sort of group, and you're going to get to meet with all these folks. So Lenny is a founder of a startup. Shannon is right there. Shannon's at a community college. Audrey and Sarah are both at universities, NC State, Berkeley. Eric's at a nonprofit called AdGene. Emily Landine right there. And these guys will get introduced, so don't worry, this is the roughest introduction ever. But she's a consultant at Thrivner. I'm a geneticist in industry at Bayer Crop Sciences, and Vivian over here is a freelance journalist. You'll learn more about these folks and you'll get a chance to meet them. So we have 8 panelists and we have 90 minutes. I think if I did the math right, you're going to get to spend maybe 10 minutes with each panelist as we rotate. The other option is you get like 12 or 13 minutes, but you only get to meet with 7 of the 8. Maybe we should do a vote. So vote if you want to meet everybody, but less time. Raise your hand. All right, I'm feeling like, is this clear? Yeah, okay. How about the alternative? You want to meet 7 of the 8, and you're going to miss someone, but you get more time. I feel like we're going fast. That's the slight consensus, and there was maybe about a 2-to-1 edge on that. Okay, so we're going to do like, you're going to get to meet all 8 of these folks in small groups for 10 minutes. So talk quick. That's all I have, and I'll turn it over to Lynn.
As Lex said, I'm Lenny, and one thing that I want to start with is just acknowledging the SSE for putting this together, putting the funding towards this, and this is actually the people that you see here were involved starting, I think, 2015 in getting together, proposing to the society, at the request of the society, proposing what the society could do better for the trainees in terms of diverse careers. So we got together with these folks, and really Mohammed Noor is the one who pushed this idea forward that SSE should be doing something towards this. Got a group of people together back in 2015 to make recommendations to the society. The society said, we love the idea, put some funding towards it for the panelists to come in. So that was an effort that got started in 2015. We did the first one of these in Austin in 2016, then another one in Portland. This is our 3rd time doing it. And one of the things you'll notice is every time we do it, well, you wouldn't notice it, but those of us who have done it, we do it slightly differently. So your feedback on what worked, what didn't, for the next people, this is something that's going to keep happening at every Evolution conference. So your feedback on what you liked, what you didn't like, what you wish we did more of is super, super helpful. These are the people who have helped to get this going from the very beginning. I don't have the acknowledgements for all of the panelists, even from today, and I certainly am missing the ones that were in Austin and in Portland. But I think the main point is that this is a mostly volunteer effort. It is a completely volunteer effort, and there are people from the society, there are people who are coming in from the diverse sectors that you'll be talking to, who just believe that this is something that society should be doing that can benefit us. Right? And that's the only slides that I have prepared. But what I want to take you through is your own thoughts. And so many of you have filled out the pre-workshop survey on how prepared you are, what your thoughts are about your career prospects, right? So the first question was, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident you are about your overall career prospects, right? And from very low to neutral to very high. The good news is, so this was the question, do you think you'll have a job? And the good news is that statistically, you're in very good shape. So I think something like 2% of PhDs may be unemployed, and some of it will be for personal reasons, could be transient. So you will have a job. That's not the point of this workshop. The point is, will you have a job that you like? Will you be prepared? And how do you figure out what job you should have? So that gets a little bit into shadier territory. So on a scale of 1 to 5, rate, and we've had a lot of responses, right? Rate how prepared you feel for the career other than being a tenure-track professor. And one person, congratulations. You are very prepared. And most others fall along these lines. It actually would be interesting for those of us who have done it in 2016, it would be interesting to compare if this is changing at all, but I don't have that. I haven't assessed the survey results from before. But that's really what we'll be focusing on, trying to get you a little bit more comfortable with what are my options and how do I go about exploring them. Okay? And then descending into this like less and less confidence questions. Descending into that zone, rate how aware you feel you are about career options beyond being a tenure-track professor, right? Not at all, a little bit, well, that probably same one person. Prepared for life, aware of everything, but might not be at this workshop even. Filling this out when I'm done. The rest of us are probably somewhere closer to what I was feeling like as a graduate student in Berkeley. So I did my PhD in evolution of heterochromatin and yeast, 2003 to 2009. I was a math major in the beginning. I came into Berkeley. I'm all excited. And then in my 4th year, I get to my 3rd year blues. I was slower than most, so it took me an extra year. And I'm thinking like, oh, I'm not cut out to be a scientist. I'm not good enough. The imposter syndrome. So everything is there, and I'm thinking I should just leave. It's going to be another 2-3 years. If I get a PhD, I should just leave. So what could I do? And suddenly I realized I think I was more marketable before I went to graduate school. Like I'm a Perl expert now, but Google doesn't need people who know Perl. Like I was turning down as a math major, computer science minor before going into science. I was turning down in New York, offers from hedge funds to do programming. And suddenly I'm thinking like, whoa, what can I possibly do? I know that if it's not a professor, then I guess you could be an editor, you can be in industry, there are biotechs, and I know some people who applied to McKinsey, you could be a consultant. But it felt like that's really it, right? And that's not true. And we know that it's not true because before we launched this first workshop, what we actually did, before asking you guys how you feel, we talked to your advisors, and we sent a survey, SSE sent a survey to all of the faculty asking, where are your trainees? Are they in academia? Are they out of academia? And if they're out of academia, what are they doing now? And so we've put together a website, Evolution Careers, right? So these are your peers. Where are they now? So I don't know if we have anywhere in the handouts or anywhere. Do we have a link to this? You can Google for it.
Yeah,
it's
you can.
Evolution's post-PhD. Evolution post-PhD. And what we have here is a little bit about the workshop, and then we have the data. It's very appropriate for science conference. So we've surveyed who is where, how many people are in faculty versus outside, right? And the important part is not, is it 44% or is it 40% for in academia? That will change over time. It might be a little bit lower now. There's recall bias. So the key part is not what that number is, but that the main point is there are a lot of people that are in academia who have graduated. There are a lot of people who are out. And then we break down what are the types of things people do. And so we have a lot of responses for a lot of trainees. And then at the bottom, there is an actual link to the spreadsheet of all of the responses that we got. So one simple thing you could do is go to this website and then just look like, what are the types of jobs that people from this community hold now, right? If they're outside of academia. So there are jobs. They're not just in consulting and publishing and biotech, right? And that's one of the main points that I want to get across. But then if we go back to the survey, as the awareness, if we go back to the survey, so this is how likely are you to apply for the jobs. Oh, I wanted to focus on this, how prepared you feel, right? And this also was really strong for me as I was thinking, like, what if I don't stay in academia? What am I really good at? Pearl and the 3 genes that I'm studying. And what I've learned, since is that that's absolutely not the case, right? So society values you as a scientist, whether you're in or outside of academia. For my own, I won't talk really about Protocols.io, but for my own last 7 years of being co-founder and now the CEO of Protocols.io, I really can't think of preparation training better than graduate school for what I'm doing now in a startup, right? We've grown from 1 person to now having 15 people, right? And for getting the funding, the business development, getting the product, giving talks, there's a lot that your graduate education gives you, sort of has you, like, almost on a subconscious level. You don't realize it, right? But like, you're dealing with rejection, maybe one of the most, all the time, right? From journals, from fellowships. That might be the most awful feeling you have and the most valuable training you're getting, right, as a scientist. You are dealing with the nightmares of scheduling your thesis committee and then actually, doing your qualifying exam, your lab meetings, you're presenting to a critical, skeptical audience all the time. These are all skills we're not thinking about. We're just going through and we're focused on the topic. And of course, the most important part is when you come out as a scientist, or you do have that PhD, your training is about an approach to problem solving. Right? So all of these things combined are, and I'm not just making it up, you will talk to people from in and outside of academia, and they can tell you, like, yes, this is really what makes you valuable. So there are, it turns out now that we're a startup and we're talking to VCs, I learned that venture capitalists hire scientists to do due diligence for them, right? Like, they're investing $20 million. They really want to make sure that the science is solid in the company that they're about to back. It turns out that law firms will hire scientists just because of your science background, not the particular protein you're studying, or organism, right? They will hire you, and they'll pay for you to go to law school if you want to, and they'll pay you a really good salary because you're a scientist, right? And not because you're good at pipetting or assembling ocean material, right? So you are valuable, and all of that is good news. But then I think the hard thing is, if you look through the survey responses, and if you believe me, which you should, that you're valuable as a scientist to society, whether in or outside of academia, then the question is, okay, that's great. There are options, and I'm valuable. but how do I go about finding the right career for me, right? And this whole workshop, one of the things we want to get you slightly more comfortable with is what are the next steps in exploring, right? And wherever you answered, whether you're likely to apply for jobs outside of academia or not, it's not about academia is bad and startups are good, not at all. After 7 years of startup, I don't recommend anybody to start. I love Protocols.io, no regrets for doing it, but it's hard. It's probably less certain and more anxiety-inducing than even science and academia. But the real question is, how do you find the fit for you? How do you evaluate what the options are? And how do you try to figure out what will make you happy, what is a good fit given where you want to go, and just having the options, right? Maybe you'll get a faculty position, maybe you won't, maybe it is a good fit for you, maybe it's not. And as you see here, we asked a question about tenure track, right? But a lot of people might be in academia, stay in academia, and be at a teaching university, right? And doing less research and more teaching. What is that like? So it's really about evaluating the options. It's how to get started. And some of these things will be common sense, but I really wish I had this as a graduate student, that I had this workshop at one of the conferences, because in that 4th year, or maybe I shouldn't have, because then I would have just left because I would feel that I had options. But joking aside, that really is the motivation for the workshop. It's not about stay or leave. It's about how do you assess the options, how do you figure out what the options are, and explore for yourself what's the right thing. Les, anything you, or anybody else from the original organizers? Am I leaving anything out? I think 121, but we started 2 minutes late.
Yes.
So we'll come right on time.
I think you're good.
All right.
Thank you, Lenny. All right, so that was a great kickoff of what we're doing here today. I hope it's clear. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about career exploration strategies. So I want to give a really brief preface to this. We're going to spend about 40 minutes on this, so hopefully around 2 I'll be done. So this is presented by me, Lex Flagel. Maybe I should stay behind the mic. Or am I loud enough if I wander over here, folks in the back? Okay, great. This was prepared by Elizabeth Silva, or Liz Silva. She is a dean at UC San Francisco. So this is really her material, and she's been nice enough to present it with me. Some of you might know UC San Francisco doesn't have undergraduates, it's grad only. So they're very focused on tools, techniques, and ideas for graduate and professional students to explore careers. Most universities have career offices. Most of it's focused on undergrad careers. UC San Francisco is really unique in that they don't have undergrads, so their people are focused heavily on grads, which is different than undergrad career exploration. So that's the idea. The other thing I want to tell you about is my own career exploration. So I did a PhD in evolutionary biology. I did a postdoc also in population genetics. About 2012, I was offered a faculty position and tenure track, research faculty, and I froze. I completely froze and realized that didn't feel right. I went for my second visit, interviewed, I went for my second visit, they showed me lab spaces, all this stuff, and I thought, oh my God, I don't want to do this. This is not, I don't want to recruit grad students, I don't want to apply for funding. So the reason I'm engaged in this workshop, in part, is I went through a very traumatic experience. Luckily, the university was very kind about it, and I said, look, I need to do some career exploration. I started interviewing for industry jobs. I happened to be in the Raleigh-Durham area, so it was convenient. There's a lot of industry in that area. I did a couple industry job interviews, and I knew immediately, like within an hour, like this was the right fit for me. What I didn't do was any career exploration. I just went, you know, undergrad to grad, grad to postdoc, postdoc, tenure track job, and I never, that was just the pipeline, right? And I never gave it any thought until it was very, very late in the game. I can tell you things worked out well for me, but the reason I think this workshop is important, and the reason it is important to me, is to hopefully try to steer a few of you onto a path of doing some early exploration so you don't end up like me with a lot of sleepless nights and a major sort of change in all your plans at the last minute. So that's kind of a brief introduction about myself. The other thing I want to say is sort of getting some first things for some like real level setting for career exploration. So for most of us, this is work. The jobs don't fall in your lap. Everyone knows, and maybe some of you have, you know, like a person who was on an airplane and started talking to their seatmate, and you know, the good conversation, one thing led to another, and wow, they got a job out of that, right? Like that can happen, but that is not a plan. That is not a good idea. That, you know, if that's your goal for your career, most of you aren't, you know, out of this room of 60, 70 people, maybe one of you will have that happen. But for the rest of us, we need a plan, and it's an active thing, it's work. The second thing is, it's a skill. You're gonna need to learn the skill, and you're gonna need to practice. It's no different than pipetting, or, you know, computer programming, or something like that. This is something that you're going to get better at over time, and you have to practice and you have to work at it. So set aside time for, again, this is the thing I didn't do, is develop this skill until super late in the game. Career exploration can push you out of your comfort zone. You're going to meet with people, experts in these different fields later today. For some of you, that can be stressful, right? You want to put your best foot forward. You want to learn about their jobs. And sometimes that can stress you out a little bit. It's like taking a risk. It pushes you. That's okay. And then remember, it gets easier as you do more of it. And also, though, career exploration can be really fun and really exciting, right? You get to learn about all these interesting things. Like you can learn about what it's like to work or found a startup from Lenny. So that's really cool. And then the final thing is, for most of us, you know, we're not going to do career exploration just for a year or two, find our dream job, and then stick with it for the rest of our lives. Most of you will make a couple career changes, right? So your career trajectory will change over time. And so this is kind of a lifelong process. You might be doing different types of career exploration several times throughout your working life. So anyway, that's kind of I just want to set all this up. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir, because the folks who will sign up for this workshop, pay the $20, fly in early, and be here, you guys kind of know this already, but I think it's still good that we don't sort of gloss over the effort that needs to go into career exploration if you want to make it work for you. All right, so how do I start with career exploration? What is the first step? And this is my advice, and also the advice from UC San Francisco. It's get on LinkedIn. And I'm not hearing any audible groans, so that's kind of good. I bet one or two of you in your head were like, oh gosh. I told my wife about this, and she was like, really, LinkedIn? It's a social network. We all have mixed feelings about social networks. You know, kind of like, okay. And this is a particular social network. It's, I would say, fairly uncool. But I will try to explain to you in a few slides what it's really good for and how you can use it to your own advantage. So why do you need LinkedIn? And let me be real clear, you don't need LinkedIn. All the stuff we're going to talk about you could do without LinkedIn. LinkedIn just makes it easier. So LinkedIn is, first, it's a place where people can learn about you as a professional. So it allows you to paint a picture of yourself on the web as a professional. And so let me give you an example. So I told you my name is Lex Flegel. Some of you might be like, oh, who is this guy? What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to Google me. I'm sort of fortunate. I have a weird name, so I come up on a Google search. And what will you find on Google? You might find like a Facebook page or my Twitter account or something like that. You might find some lab that I was affiliated with forever ago, right? That's like sorely out of date. And at best, it might just have a picture of me and my name. Maybe if you're lucky, there's a little blurb about what I did. But it's not really, these things aren't me as a professional. On this lab page, I would be some alum from 10 years ago, right? Like it's super out of date. It doesn't say who I am now. It doesn't say anything about my career aspirations today. And then you'll find my papers. And again, they're nice. They have some information, but they're old and they're not up to date. They don't say where I'm at now. And so this is kind of the smattering of things you typically find without something like LinkedIn. And so LinkedIn really is more than sort of a publication record. It's more than your social media stuff. It's a place where you can actually write down a narrative about who you are and who you aspire to be as a professional. So that's one thing. The second thing about LinkedIn that makes it really useful is that your network is really far-reaching. And I'll show you guys an interesting example of this in a second. And LinkedIn is an easy way to assess it. So remember, I say you don't have to do this. If you don't want to do social media, don't. You have a network. You know people. Those people know people. You can identify individuals and careers you're interested in exploring through that network. LinkedIn just basically curates it and puts it on the web and allows you to search it in 30 seconds. So let me show you kind of, I think all you guys are comfortable with how social networking works, but this is kind of the way LinkedIn works. So you have you up in the upper left there, and you start connecting with what they call the first order connections. And these are people typically you know pretty well, like people sometimes literally who are 10 feet away from you at work. Those people have connections. They're kind of second order, and now we're starting to get people maybe you know a little bit or don't know at all, like you're someone in industry at Genentech, maybe that's a company you're interested in exploring. And then finally, LinkedIn allows you to see out to the third order connections, and now you can start to find people that really would be difficult for you to track down, right? So if you wanted to meet a data scientist at Google, without LinkedIn, you could spend probably a few weeks or a month, and I'm sure you could find someone, get their contact info, and set up an opportunity to meet with them, talk with them. With LinkedIn, you could find it in a few seconds, and there's a mechanism where you can reach out to them. So LinkedIn has this really nice built-in networking tool that allows you to identify professionals you want to learn from and set up informational interviews with them, and we'll talk about what an informational interview is in a minute. The other thing is it's a social networking site. People post things, they're mostly job-related things. You don't have to participate in any of the social networking aspects to use it. You can just kind of glean the networking part. So I've been on LinkedIn for, I don't know, 5 years or something like that. I've never posted a single thing. I don't read anything that anyone posts. I simply use it only to allow people to reach out to me if they want to learn about my job and what it's like to work in industry. And I use it to reach out to other people to do the same thing, to learn about different careers. So you can use it. It's a social network that you can use without doing any social network. That's basically the point. So let me give you like a really concrete example from my own LinkedIn. So I think I have about 200 or 250 first order connections on LinkedIn. So I don't have a huge network, and it's mostly plant scientists because that's the people I know. And I thought to myself a few nights ago when I was putting this together, if I was out of plant science, what would be like just a cool thing to work on? And I thought, I like bikes. Maybe I'll work for a bike manufacturer. So I went to my LinkedIn and I typed in Trek, which is a big US bike manufacturer. And once I got their corporate name right, it's Trek Bicycle Corporation. I just put in Trek Bikes first and it didn't work. But once I put that in, I got a list of 25 people. This is just the first 5 that all work at Trek. And so we have, sort of a CFO and a director of web tech and humanities, whatever, right? And I can message or I can connect with some of these people. And so within 30 seconds, and I have to be clear, I don't know a soul in the bike industry. I don't know a single person that works in that area. But somehow through my third order connections, so people I know who know people know these people, basically. And so if I were going to make a switch, I could reach out to some of these folks, I could connect with them, I could message them, and I could say, hey, I'm a scientist in crop genetics right now. I'm interested in exploring what it's like to work in the bike industry. Can you put me in touch with a scientist at your company or something like that, right? So I could start to network in this area that's completely out of my field of knowledge or expertise. And so this is the useful bit of LinkedIn, basically. If you're going to use it, this is the thing that it does pretty well. The other stuff you can kind of take it. So how do you get started with LinkedIn? We're going to go through this quick because I think most of you guys know how to set up accounts and social networking, but there are a few kind of funky quirks about LinkedIn. So to get started, you need a photo. Here's a nice example of someone from UC San Francisco. So what do they say? It's all pretty general advice. Your photo, the background, it's good if it's blurry. You want to be well lit, sort of natural, relaxed, good light. You want it to be sort of a square of your head and shoulders. LinkedIn will allow you to, it will eventually crop it as a circle, so all the pictures show up as circles. So sort of think of like, do I have a photo with a good circle? Don't use a selfie, have someone help you take the picture. Yeah, and dress professionally. So basic, I think, standard advice on a good professional photo applies here. The next thing is you want to start to fill out your experiences and your accomplishments, so things like patents, publications, the languages you speak, your transferable skills, that kind of thing. You can start to go through, and this is all pretty self-explanatory. I don't think we'll dwell on that too long. But there is one key thing. You have this headline that comes under your name. I don't know if you noticed all those people from Trek. It had sort of their job description, right? And you could learn very quickly, like, oh, this person's in HR, this person's in marketing, this person's on the web. You're going to have that too, and that's that headline there. And for this person, Diana, it says postdoctoral scholar at UC San Francisco. And the experts say this is not actually a very good headline. It's too vague. And let me show you why. If you go on there on LinkedIn and you search postdoc or postdoctoral scholar, you're going to get zillions of people doing all kinds of different things, and it's a very sort of broad, generic, descriptive term. And so there is sort of a way you can improve your how you present yourself on LinkedIn by being really specific in that headline. So one option is to say postdoctoral scholar in immunology or something, right? So say specifically what you're a postdoc in. The other thing is to say, I'm a scientist. You don't need to know my rank. You can look up that down the page. What you need to know is the science I do, which is structural biology or biochemistry or evolutionary biology or something like that. So just forget your sort of academic rank and just put what kind of scientist you are. The other thing you can do in this space, and I think this is really good if you're thinking about different careers, is you can sort of say your aspirations. So maybe you're a neuroscientist who's just started doing some freelance writing. You can put that, neuroscientist and freelance writer. Or developmental biologist, interested in business development, right? So that actually says who you are now, but also what you aspire to be. And so this headline you can use to try to kind of put yourself in a specific category that you want to be in. All right. The next thing is the summary, and we'll spend a little time talking about this because it is, I think, important. So this is the piece where I said, Facebook and Google Scholar and your lab of your former or current advisor, they lack a summary of you as a scientist, and so this is why you want a LinkedIn profile, is so that you can write a summary and you can say who you are. This is the thing that's hard to find elsewhere about you on the web, and so you're going to write a narrative about who you are as a professional and maybe about what you want to, what you aspire to do next. This is, like I said, a narrative. You're going to write, don't paste in bullet points of your CV or whatever. Like, you're going to write an actual narrative about you. Sometimes it's really hard to write. Like, you got 4 or 5 sentences about you, and you might stare at the computer for a long period of time and say, I don't know what to say about me. A good place to start, or 2 good places to start, are something called MyADP, and I'll show you the link to these later, and the other one's called Imagine PhD. Both of these are websites found. One, I think, is kind of supported by UC San Francisco and maybe the NIH, that's MyADP, and the Imagine PhD is supported by another set of universities, I forget. And both of these, you go on, takes maybe an hour. You go through a set of questions, and they're not to tell you what career you would be good in. They're not going to say, oh, you should be a banker, or you should be in sales. They are websites that assess your skills, your interests, and your values. And so they can be very helpful for figuring out, like, I like organization at work, and I like clear communication and sort of teamwork. And I like a lot of time to myself to be creative or something. I need like focused blocks of quiet to be creative. That says something about you, and it can help you, I think about what careers you'd want to be in. So I'd encourage you to try both of these websites. The MyADP site is focused more on STEM majors. The Imagine PhD is more humanities focused. However, you can use I've heard of people in STEM using the Imagine PhD one and having good luck with it too. So I think they're not specific enough that you should choose one or the other necessarily. Okay, and then the final thing about the summary is sort of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Do something now. Write 4 sentences now. Get it on LinkedIn. Get your profile up and iterate. And you're probably going to iterate a lot. You might change this several times. You might think, I want to be in, I want to work for a government agency. You might meet some people in government agencies, and you might say, I need to rewrite this. I'm not going to work at a government agency, right? Like, that's totally fine. So be ready to iterate. So I stole a colleague of mine's. I didn't tell him this, but I went to his LinkedIn, and I stole his profile. I think it's pretty good. I think it's worth talking about. So this is his 4-sentence summary. Well, I'll just read it. He says, I'm a data scientist at Bayer working on everything. I have considerable experience in experimental design, statistics, genomics, bioinformatics, and data science. I'm fluent in R and Python and have contributed to R package development. I'm a certified instructor for both software and data carpentry foundations. Okay, so 4 sentences, you have a good sense of who this person is, right? Like, that paints a really clear picture. There's a few things about this. Oh, and then I should note, this person pasted in his resume. And so this isn't his resume, this is a narrative. But if you want to learn, well, where did he go to school? And he says he's good at experimental design. Let me see, does he have a background that suggests that that's real, that kind of thing. You can click on that resume. But for most of us, this is a pretty good picture of who this person is. So I have a couple critiques. Maybe you guys have some others. Some of this is very subjective. I think some of it's a little more objective. So the first critique is the sort of, I'm working on everything. I think it's a little, for me, that's a little too cute. I would like put something specific, you know what I mean? Like, I'm working on something. And I actually know this person. He's not working on everything. We do a lot of stuff he doesn't do. And so, put something, I would put something specific, but it's good to say what you're working on. The other thing I notice about this, he's in a career. He maybe isn't doing career exploration. He doesn't have a lot of things about his aspirations, per se. He's not saying, I'm trying to get a role in whatever. But you could put that if that's where you're at. But he does sort of have his interests, his experience, and his values. You can kind of get that from the, he's an instructor, right? That tells you he cares, that tells you something about his values. He cares about teaching people these software skills. The other thing, and this is I think one of the more subjective ones, every sentence starts with I, and 3 of the 4 start with I am. You could make that a little more diverse, basically, and interesting. But like, it gets the job done too, you know what I mean? So that, I think that's whatever. It doesn't have to be perfect. But anyway, so that's, I think, a decent example. All right, a couple quirks. LinkedIn has some weird quirks. The first thing is something they call your profile stats. So if you're on LinkedIn, you probably know this. There's this thing that pops up and it says, a person viewed your profile in the last 90 days, which isn't how other social networking sites, they usually don't tell you who's looking at your stuff. But LinkedIn does, and you can click on that, and someone pops up, and you're like, oh wow, Elizabeth Silva is looking at my profile, okay. That's interesting, and like, so just be prepared for that. There are ways you can turn it off. You can go to privacy and settings, and in there you can choose the type of account you want. You can have a fully, your name and everything detailed. You can have a more anonymous one that says not your name, and then you can have a fully anonymous one. I think, to be honest, to make it work best for networking, the top one is probably the one you're going to want with your actual name and stuff like that. But if you're not comfortable with that, there are some options. There's this funny thing where if you make changes to this is like a nightmare. I don't know if they've updated this or not, but if you make any little changes to your profile, like you just change your picture or you change your little summary statement by a word, it blasts every one of your first order connections with like, hey, Lex has updated his profile. And generally speaking, go in and turn that off. You don't need that kind of thing. I'm not sure if this is the default anymore or not, but it's something to be mindful of. If you put your email in, your first order connections can see your email address. I believe there's a way to change that. Possibly just don't put your email in. Oh yeah, the suggested contacts. So when you log in, it will start to suggest people you should connect with. You'll get a page that kind of looks like this. It has their pictures, and you might think to yourself, oh my gosh, Nick, I knew that. Where do I know that person? If you click on this part of it, above the connect symbol, you can go view their profile. They can see you're viewing their profile potentially, but you can at least go like, oh yeah, now I know where that person is. If you click on this thing right here, I know this is kind of obvious, but if you click on this, it will send a message to them right away, and you can't pull it back, and it'll say, you know, so-and-so would like to connect. So just be aware when it suggests people, if you hit that connect thing because you're trying to figure out who they are or how you know them, it will immediately try to connect. The final thing is this thing called skills, and it's a real mixed bag, and I'll try to explain to you, I think, the right way to use it. So there's this link to skills, and you'll go in and you'll start typing in your skills, and there are some settings. So you'll write in, you know, molecular biology, computational biology, lab biology, something like that. You'll start listing your skills. The skills are good. They allow you to define yourself and turn up in searches. So if someone writes one of your skills, they can find you. It also helps LinkedIn figure out who you should connect with, which can be useful. There's this thing called endorsements. Let me see. There's, yeah, show me suggestions to endorse my connections, and include me in endorsement suggestions to my connections. I think you want to click those off. You don't want, oh yeah, here it is at the top. Where it says I want to be endorsed, I think you want to click no. What endorsements is basically like if you write some skill, someone else will say like, oh yeah, they'll click on it and they'll say, yeah, for sure, Lex is a good, you know, molecular biologist or something like that. It's basically useless, to be honest with you, because people that endorse you don't know, and not everyone uses it. So big picture, I would just turn that off and not try to use an endorsements thing. I also suspect it might go away in the future anyway. Okay, so a little bit of homework and a plug for our booth tomorrow. So one of your pieces of homework, if you want to, is to set up a LinkedIn profile with your photo and other things like we talked through. Connect with 5 people, any people. We showed you the kind of, like somehow in my network, I've connected with people at bike manufacturers. So, and that was not, you know, by very strategic connection. And so just start connecting with people you know, people you're comfortable with. And then tomorrow we're going to have a booth at the poster session. I don't know the booth number. You can probably look it up. It'll be the diverse careers. And if you want, we'll have folks there. We can help you set up your LinkedIn if you bring a laptop. We can sort of talk that through with you. We'll have some other things at the booth as well. But anyway, that's kind of a bit about LinkedIn. We're going to switch gears now and talk about informational interviews. Maybe I'll pause for 1 or 2 questions. Does anyone have a question off the bat? Okay.
I know ResearchGate is kind of similar to LinkedIn. How do you kind of weigh up the two?
What's the other one?
ResearchGate.
Oh, ResearchGate. Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know enough about ResearchGate to give you a great answer, but I think it is, if I understand it right, it's evolving towards being a networking tool as well. I think one difference, I would say, is ResearchGate is definitely focused on the publishing academic sciences. Those folks at Trek Bikes maybe have never written a paper and have no idea about ResearchGate, whereas LinkedIn's a much bigger sphere, right? If your career search, you know, you can definitely have both, right? If your career search is really focused on the kinds of people who are going to have publications and going to have ResearchGate accounts, then that's probably a big enough network for you. On the other hand, if your search is really broad, there might be pockets of people you would want to connect with that just have no awareness of ResearchGate or that kind of thing. Yeah. Lenny.
Just to add to that, ResearchGate is usually called LinkedIn for academics. So if you're thinking of going beyond academia, right, they do job advertising. So it is a place to become a profile where possibly someone looking for your expertise will find you. But if we're talking about you reaching out to the network to do informational interviews that Lex will talk about and learning more about things outside of academia, it's not probably going to be as useful because it is really geared towards academics.
Yeah. Thanks. That's good advice. The other thing I forgot to say at the beginning, but I'll say now in case you're wondering, I am not affiliated with LinkedIn. This is just a suggestion. I'm not pitching it or selling it. It is just a tool that turns out to be useful for career exploration. All right, so we'll switch gears now. And it looks like the snacks and stuff are arriving, so sorry about the slight distraction. I'll try to be loud. So informational interviews. Big picture, you're going to do this very soon with people, so pay attention. And this was prepared by Jenny Dorman, also at UC San Francisco in this MIND program, Motivating Informed Decisions. And I'm going to tell you really briefly about what an informational interview is and why you want to do these for career exploration. So what is it? It's an interview you're going to have with a member of your professional network to get advice, to learn about future opportunities, and to gain more contacts in that area. You want to learn what someone does in their job as a way of exploring your own career options, right? So you're in a position where you don't know much about this career. You want to meet someone who's in it, and you want to ask them questions. Basically, you want to interview them and figure out, is this a career I would like? Is this something that interests me, that would fit my skills, my values? And also, you want to test your ideas about your career path. So you want to get advice from them. You want to say, okay, I have this PhD in molecular biology. I see you do this. Is that would I have skills that would be useful in that career, right? And likewise, you also want to practice your story and see how it lands. So you want to say, I've been exploring freelance journalism, and I've written a few things. And I'm interested in learning more about what you do as a freelance journalist. And here's kind of my pitch for how I'm preparing myself to launch into this career, and they can kind of steer you on your pitch in a way. So this is kind of the basic point of an informational interview. Typical informational interviews, and I should say I probably do between 5 and 10 of these a year, mostly through LinkedIn. People reach out to me, and this is very consistent with my experience. It's a conversation request, so someone will reach out to me and say, I want to know what it's like to work in the crop science industry. We usually schedule something for a half hour to an hour. If we're in the same location, we do it in person, but phone and video chat work pretty well. Email is okay, but not great because it has that time delay and stuff like that. And like if you're testing your ideas and stuff, you kind of want to know the difference between someone saying like, well, that could work, versus like, oh yeah, that could work, right? And in email, sometimes it's hard to tell those two things apart. But through voice, you can get their, you can get a better understanding of how they feel about something. Okay, as important as what an informational interview is, it's important to stress what it isn't. You're not going into this to get a job. Like in this half hour or hour you meet with this person, you're not going to ask them, okay, can I have a job, And it's generally not appropriate to do informational interviews with people who are in an organization that you're applying to work in. So once you've applied, you should have already done the informational interviews. You should have done your homework before you applied, right? So if you're applying to work somewhere, you shouldn't request informational interviews from those folks. That can be a kind of red flag sometimes. That said, informational interviews can lead to a job, but it's really networking when you need the information before you need the job, right? So this is stuff you do, 6 months, a year, something like that, before you need the job. And it may be that the person that you're doing informational interviews with decides that you're someone they'd like to recruit, and that could turn into a job. But that's something that happens down the line, and we'll sort of talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so how to request an informational interview. If you have the person's email, ask by email. You can send a message in LinkedIn. I get these, like I said, probably 5 or 10 a year, or in person if you personally can connect with the person. Suggest an in-person meeting or a phone call if that's not applicable. Keep your request short and to the point. They say put the ask in early, like basically tell them, you don't want to write like 4 pages about all this stuff and then at the very bottom say like, hey, I'd like to meet with you for a half hour. And mention the name of the person who connected you if that's applicable. So if someone gave you their email, it's always good to say, I got your email from so-and-so. And don't be offended if they're slow to reply or they don't answer at all. The career folks tell me that the typical response rate is about 50%. So this is one of those things that can put you out of your comfort zone. You might ask 5 people and not get a single reply. Sometimes that's just the way it goes with a 50% on average response rate. Don't feel like, if that happens, don't feel like, oh my gosh, they must have looked me up and they think I'm a terrible, for this career or whatever. Don't let that reflect on you. It's just folks in different careers are busy and they don't all respond to requests for informational interviews. And so be persistent. All right, so we'll go through kind of the basic structure of a request. Hopefully this is pretty clear, but you want an opening where you mention how you get their contact info. If you're on LinkedIn, it's kind of obvious how you got it. A summary statement about who you are and why you're contacting them, or a request for a meeting, and a thank you. So it's 4 simple parts. So I'll show you an example that they have here. I'll read it. It says, hello, Nicole. So the subject, this is an email, not a LinkedIn, but an email, request for informational interview. Hello, Nicole. I received your contact info from my classmate, Peter Smith, who sends his warm regards. I'm a 4th-year grad student in biomedical sciences at UC San Francisco. I find basic research fascinating. I'd like to find a setting with more impact on human health and investigating preclinical research, and Peter suggested that you would be a great person to talk with to learn what it's like to work in your field and whether my biochemistry and pharmacological experience would be relevant. Do you have 30 minutes to meet? Thank you, Samantha. I would actually say, if I'm being totally honest, you could cut this down considerably. I think the start is good. The screen section, the critique I would say is 2 things. One is I wouldn't bother saying I find basic research fascinating, but after graduating I'd like to do something with more impact. I would just leave that out and say I want to learn more about your career, you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to justify yourself and why you're doing your career search, right? Like, just tell them you want to learn about them. The other thing I would critique is this kind of, I'd like to talk to you and learn what it's like and whether my biochemical and pharmacological experience is relevant. Honestly, when people do informational interviews with me, I don't want them to feel like, sometimes I ask them like, hey, they'll tell me about themselves for a minute, and then they'll say, do you think I have the right skills? I'm not like a tester of that, you know what I mean? I'm not going to say like, nope, sorry, you're out, And so I think what's better in an informational interview is for you to ask them what they think the right skills are, and then for you to assess whether you have them or not. But don't put that on them as some sort of gatekeeper who's going to tell you that. And so that's the 2 kind of tweaks I would say about these is don't feel like you have to justify why you're doing this and why you're transitioning or exploring careers, and don't feel like they are going to be the gatekeepers on whether you have the skills necessary. Just tell them you want to learn about the skills. Okay, so you'll reach out to people, and then some of them will agree, and now you have to meet them. And this can be stressful, right? Like when you get that response that says, great, do you have time next Thursday? Let's talk. Your heart will sometimes skip a beat, and that's okay. So what do? You need to research them and their organizations, right? You want to go into this informed. You want to know as much about them and the company they work for and what they do as you can. You want to draft a list of questions, and I'll have some example questions, and we'll have some printouts at the booth tomorrow if you want to get some example questions. You want to rehearse a little bit, I think, an opening statement. You're going to meet them, say, hi, I'm Lex, something, right? Like you need like 3 or 4 sentences of something that you're going to go lead with. I think it's a good idea. They suggest here to bring a printed copy of your resume, maybe your card, if you have a card, something like that. Something you can give them so that they can have some artifact that reminds them of who you are and how to get in touch with you. You want to arrive early and dress nice. I mean, treat this like they're volunteering to meet with you. You want to, do your best to present yourself well and be on time. It's kind of obvious stuff. A little about etiquette. Follow their lead on where and how to meet. So if they say, for example, oh, I work in an office building downtown. Could you meet next Tuesday over my lunch break at a cafe? That may mean you got to sort of schlep yourself downtown. But don't ask them like, oh, could you come to campus and come, meet with me in my lab or something like that. So the onus is on you to try and get to them. Or if they're in your city and they say, I'd rather not meet in person, can we do Skype? Then Skype them, that's fine, They say here it's appropriate to offer to buy them coffee or lunch. I think that's fine. If they suggest a cafe, you can say, hey, I'll pick up the coffee. I'll be honest with you, whenever I meet with people, I always offer to buy the coffee too. And so I think whatever, usually we end up going Dutch or whatever, we pay for our own. But anyway, expect that maybe this is going to cost you a few bucks. And then respect their time and don't go over without checking in. So if you say, let's meet for 30 minutes and it's 28 minutes, you might want to stop and say, hey, this has been really great. I just want to let you know you gave me 30 minutes, we're almost there. Do you have, do you have more time or should we wrap up now, right? And let them kind of decide that. All right, so a little bit about your opening statement. A couple sentences. State your background. So you're going to introduce yourself, and then you want to get right to the point. So here's an example. Hi, I'm Lex. I finished my PhD last year in Dr. So-and-so's lab, working on something. I'm currently a postdoc in Dr. X's lab, working on a different thing. I'm thinking I might like to go into regulatory affairs. Obviously, this will resonate with the email or the LinkedIn message you sent them prior to this. So you're kind of reiterating, basically reminding them who you are and what your goal is. I'm seeking information on what it's like to work in your field. Can you tell me a bit about your role and what you do in a typical week, right? So you're going to ask them basically what's your job like. So you introduce yourself and get right to the point. And we'll talk about questions. And I think there's some really great questions here. So the first one I think is always good is basically, tell me about your current responsibilities. Tell me about your job. What is it that you do? And hopefully you've done enough research that you kind of know what the answers to this are going to be. It's a great place to start. Another question, or kind of question, is what are the toughest problems you deal with? What's the most rewarding part of your job? What do you like about your job? What do you dislike about it? Those kind of things. I don't know if I would ask that right off the bat, but those are, I think, useful things to learn about a career that you're thinking about going into, right? If they say, like, well, the toughest part of my job is I work 80 hours a week and there's no way to get out of it, that's, like, really valuable information for you if you want work-life balance, right? And so I think it's fair to ask those things. How did you get into this field? What kinds of additional experience or training does one need to get in the field? This is, I think, what I would recommend is not to say, do I have this experience or this training, but just say, what did you do? And what do other people like you have? And then for you to assess, like, oh, okay, if I want to do this, I might need an MBA or something like that. And I see you taking pictures, and that's not a problem. No problem. But we will have these questions printed out at the booth tomorrow, too, so don't feel like you got to, like, scribble these down right now. This is a great question. What are potential future career possibilities for someone in your field? I had an informational interview with someone a couple of years ago, and I asked them a question like this, and they said something really interesting to me. They said, Lex, I'm going to retire in a few years, and I can guarantee you that the company is not going to refill my position. Like, basically, this position is a endangered species. This thing is going extinct. And that was super valuable to me because it told me, if I want to go into that area, I'm swimming upstream in a major way, and like I'm going to be constantly fighting a shrinking career path, so I asked them about that, and I think people will tend to give you really candid advice. And then I think this is a really great question too. It's toward the end of the informational interview, would you recommend anyone else I should speak to in this field? May I use your name when I contact them, right? Like they might realize, you guys might have a great conversation, you might realize that they know someone else who would be a really good person for you to talk to, right? Like they were close, but they know this other person who's a perfect fit. This is like a great way then to find your next informational interview, or interviewee. So that's kind of questions. Some kind of really good advice here is, this is about them, so keep the focus on them. I like to think of it, and I think this is great advice, like you're a journalist, you're going to write a story about them, so you need to ask good questions, you need to take notes. Like, what you would like is, a week later, to have a narrative about how that informational interview went, and what you learned from them, and what that story was. So keep the questions about them. You're going to talk a little about yourself, but really you want them to do probably 80% of the talking. And people like to talk about themselves, so it's, it's a thing you can do if you ask them good questions and sort of probe. The final thing, and I think this is good advice, I haven't personally had this, but I can imagine it happening. You don't want to bring your stuff to these things, right? So like, you don't want to go in and say, I'm really excited about, I'd like to leave academia, I have a terrible advisor, and I hate my thesis. Do you think I could work in your field, right? Like, that's a bad place to start. So this isn't an opportunity for them to give you counseling about, how to finish up your PhD and get this damn paper out the door, right? Like that, set that stuff aside. What you're trying to learn about is where you want to be in a year or 2 years or something like that. So don't bring your current, anxieties and stresses to this interview. One other thing to think about that kind of helps frame this is, why would anyone want to do an informational interview, right? So put yourself in their shoes. They're busy people. This is just like volunteer kind of stuff. Why would they do it? One reason is they enjoy reflecting on what they do, and they like to talk about what they do. They're excited about what they do. Another one is, and I think I fit in this one, I'm always interested to meet people who may be potential colleagues, or even potential competitors or something like that. But I'm interested in learning about what people younger than me are thinking about, and actually knowing them, because in 5 years, who knows, they could be my boss or something like that, right? Or they could help me find a career. And so that's one reason that I like to do it. And then another reason is because someone else did it for them, so sort of the pay it forward thing. So I think if you keep these things in mind, it makes it clearer to you how to frame your questions and how the flow of these informational interviews go. Kind of put yourself in their shoes and what their motivations are. All right, at the end of the meeting, thank them. That should be pretty self-evident. And say something specific is always good. I found your insights about teamwork really helpful. I'm going to contact this person you gave me the number for, or the email. And then this final sentence is really great. If it's okay with you, I'd like to keep in touch with you as I move forward in this process, right? So letting them know that this isn't like the end of our dialogue. I'd like to keep chatting with you. That's really a good thing to do. And then actually keep them informed. Maybe you take a job somewhere else. Let them know, hey, I enjoyed our informational interview a few months ago. I just want to let you know I took a job in this area, right? Because you never know. Maybe in a few years you might go back to having an informational interview with them again or something. After the informational interview, thank them by email, maybe mail that is suggested here. I think email's pretty standard. And again, reiterate what was specific, what was helpful, that you want to stay in touch with them. If you're not connected with them on LinkedIn, invite them to connect with you on LinkedIn. And then again, keep track, keep in touch. And then what you need to do, you have some homework. You have to reflect on what you learned. Okay, so at the end of this interview, you need to stop and pause, and you need to kind of ask yourself some questions. Do I like the people I'm interacting with in this career path? Do I want to be like them, right? Do they have the work-life balance, the salary, the questions, values that I share? Would this let me do things that I'm interested in? And does it involve a tolerable amount of things I'm not interested in? Does this career path suit my core values? Would this have the advancement potential I seek? What concerns do I have? Do I need to research these concerns further? Like maybe they brought something up that I really got to think about. And I think you'll go through this, and I think you should think about 3 buckets. So you're going to synthesize this, and you're going to put yourself in one of 3 buckets. One is like, I answered yes and positive to most of these. I'm going to keep exploring. This looks like something I could do. This looks really cool. I need to meet more people and learn more about jobs and careers in this area because I'm going to go for it. One is you meet with someone and you say, that is not the job for me. It was like a useful 30 minutes of my life, and I don't ever have to look at that again. That's fine. You can, search for something else. And then the third one is kind of a mix. Like there were some things I liked, but some things I got questions about. Again, in those cases, you need to keep exploring and talking to people. And then the final piece of advice here is meet more than one person, right? Like, and we all know this as scientists. If you have an N of 1, you have an anecdote. You don't have data. You need to meet with 3, 4, 5 people in a career that you're seriously thinking about exploring to get a sample size so you can really figure out what it looks like for you in that career from a diverse set. That is all I have. I've listed the two websites here. The MyIDP is at myidpsciencecareers.org, and Imagine PhD is imaginephd.com. The MIND program at UC San Francisco has got a lot of really good resources, and their careers website as well. They're slightly biased towards biomedical careers because that's what UCSF does, but I think there's a lot of really good advice. I believe I've gone severely over time. I apologize, but I think I could take, you know what? Let me look at the time. So yeah, I'm way over. How about this? We'll have a break, and if you guys have questions, you can ask me at the break. Does that sound all right? So just come find me at the break. Awesome. So now we have Sarah and Audrey. And I'm sorry about getting us off track, guys.
I feel like it's totally natural that we're dragging chairs behind us as we do this. Please?
It's like a little blinding. Maybe I move slightly towards the podium.
This will be super fun because I got up at 3 to get here and she went to bed at 3.
So I'm playing at it.
So running on fumes, this will be exciting for us at least.
Ask us anything. So we thought we're here to talk a little bit about sort of career trajectories and possible career pathways, and we made some one-slide bios for ourselves to help you get to know us a little better, cut through some of the boring stuff, and get to the more interesting questions.
I'm sorry, guys. I don't get this. Full screen.
Cool.
Yeah.
So there's Sarah.
Do you want to introduce me and I'll introduce you?
So actually I'll introduce us sort of together. How's
Okay,
that?
sounds perfect.
Talk a little bit about why we're up here talking to each other for the next half hour. So Sarah and I both met at we met each other at our previous jobs. And the conversation was actually in front of like the executive leadership team of her company at the time. And the two of us very quickly devolved into talking about how we ended up where we are today instead of in our R01 bench careers, right? And so that really helped us identify with each other this past experience and this future kind of shared interest in discussing more why people should be thinking about careers outside of the standard academic track is what I'm going to call it. And so Sarah and I met while she was the Associate Curator of Natural Sciences at the Oakland Museum of California. And I was at the time with the American Museum of Natural History. And today I think we'll just launch right into it without too much of a more introduction than that. But I thought today we'd interview each other a little bit about how we got where we are today. And we both, I think, identify with having a career that many people describe as interesting or non-traditional.
How did you find that?
How did you end up there? Which is usually code for like, what the hell are you doing, and how can you possibly be qualified to do what you're doing today? So I thought we'd start there.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited to ask her these questions because they're totally unvetted, and I also have, I'm trying to be well behaved.
Same.
I have like no filter. I don't think you have much of one.
Not today.
So I'll let you take the first crack.
Yeah, so I thought I'd start off with a softball question. So how did you know that you wanted to move from sort of traditional academic training into a non-traditional, into a different role? Like, was there a specific moment? Was it a gradual process? Just walk us through a little bit how your thinking evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually quite set on an academic career for a long time. So I'd gone through, as if an undergrad and a master's wasn't enough, so then I did the PhD, and then I thought I'd torture myself a little bit more, so I did a postdoc. And about 3.5 years into my postdoc, I suddenly realized that the parts of my career that I really, or the parts of what I was doing day to day that I enjoyed the most was actually mentoring the students that I had in the lab. And had a little bit less to do with the sort of discovery pieces, the management pieces. And at that moment, it also coincided with kind of this, the political climate at the time, which I know today we can talk about political climate and science all day long. But at the time there was a very public statement. Yes, ma'am.
Oh yeah, let's advance to Audrey's slide bio as well.
there was a very public moment when somebody, Sarah Palin, made a statement about how she didn't understand why taxpayer dollars were being spent on fruit fly research. I don't know how many of you in this room are old enough to remember that, but for me, that sort of struck at the heart, right? Because I was a model organism type person at the time. And I was working on C. elegans. Previously, I'd spent an ungodly amount of time, Shannon and I are looking at each other, working on Drosophila. And so this whole, this extremely pronounced gap between what public perception of science was versus what scientists perceived was important in science really stood out to me. And the path that I saw to sort of rectifying this was to spend more time in the informal education space, which led me to the American Museum of Natural History.
Nice. You want to say a little bit more about what you did there? Because I think it was an interesting week.
Yeah, it was, because so I had, all these aspirations about going into informal science education, so very naturally I became a salesperson. My job at the time was, this is one job, or two jobs prior to what was last listed here, but I was actually I was a director of business development as part of the business development group at the American Museum of Natural History. And so you think like museums, they got stuff. Sarah's weeping inside as I say it like this, but they've got stuff, they put it out, people come, people look at it. Why would there possibly be business development or sales as part of this? And that piece really came in. Museums not only have stuff, they have a lot of content. And content is extremely valuable, right? Especially now as we think about content marketing and how hard it is to generate content. There's a whole group of people in this room whose job it is probably to actually produce content. And museums have that in spades. And museums, as you know, rely on your admissions tickets and they rely on donations, but it turns out content is highly, highly marketable and can generate a substantial amount of revenue if you really wanted to use it that way. So I was part of a group that really thought about how do you take museum assets and all the resources a museum has to offer and figure out how to make money from it. It was kind of the dirty part of the museum world, as many people would say it, but on the other hand, I was like, dude, we're bringing in so much more money than you guys are getting from like donations, so I think we can just nip that conversation out.
And I met Audrey because she was trying to sell me an exhibit.
I did try to sell Sarah some stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
Instead, we became friends.
And collaborators in this very
Yeah.
specific space. So
Sure.
what I wanted to start the conversation with was, what was the first job outside of academia that you applied for? And not necessarily that you got, but what did you apply for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think my search radius was probably like a little bit wider and weirder than it maybe is right now. I think actually the first one I can remember is I applied for a job at the Brooklyn Children's Museum while I was still a grad student. I didn't even get an interview. That's a great question. So yeah, there's a lot of, you hear about the positives, but you're not hearing about the sort of negatives or the failed things that you applied for.
So what attracted you to that specific position description? What was it about that when they sort of set up this job that you said, I could do this?
Well, I don't know that I was accurately assessing what I could and could not do at that point, but I've been working on a sort of outreach program through my lab, and we had some pretty good success with science festivals and sort of a classroom implementation of this program on looking at how temperature affects caterpillar behavior, because I work in the thermal performance lab. And so this was a sort of an insect education project at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And so I was like, well, I have some informal ed experience and I have some classroom experience, and the position kind of called for both. And I was like, and it's insects, so we'll just give it a shot.
And the first job that you did get out of academia, which is the Oakland job, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember the position description for that?
I actually went back and tried to find it a few years ago,
Yeah.
and it was very long and convoluted, and I definitely didn't have all the components that were required. So there was the work that I did was mostly sort of exhibition facing, but there's a significant part of collections development. So just like if you have someone covered in your storehouse, in your warehouse, like a giant box of old insects, being able to like identify them and like run down the archives, it'll tell you who collected them. And making sure that they're properly cared for and treated and not harboring pests. So that work is something I learned on the job. So I applied for it kind of on the strength of like informal education and science communication work, and then kind of picked up cataloging and collections management while I was working.
Was there any part of that PD that you said, I have no business doing this job and I will now lose 6 weeks of sleep over it?
I think I just was so focused on like making it work and like doing a good job that I didn't even stop to think about like whether it should, whether I should be in the job or anything. I was just like, I better just make sure I can do this. Like I think I was so worried that I went past imposter syndrome into just like problem solving mode.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting, and like my one comment on this, right, is that I've written many job descriptions now myself and have been in the position to hire a lot of people. And one of the things that I think you realize as you're writing these things is that we have described this unicorn person, right? And this person doesn't exist anywhere, and certainly not for the dollar amount I'm planning on attaching to this. I was like, this is not possible. But and I think about that because I was scared basically shitless from the first PD that I ever actually was successfully hired into. And I think sometimes we get a little bit intimidated by these position descriptions, especially during the application process, and you talk yourself out of applying, right? Mm-hmm. But I think you want to keep in mind that hiring managers are trying to get kind of the best sense of what they might need in the future. And so they are fully aware of the fact that this unicorn is probably not in existence for $56,000 a year, and that they, but they're trying to solicit is the widest kind of possible pool of candidates.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would say about that is that there's a lot of studies that show that women and people of color are less likely to apply for jobs if they don't meet all the criteria, but that white men are not so intimidated. So I would just encourage everyone, if you think you can make a reasonable case for how you could meet the criteria for the job, go ahead and apply. Don't sell yourself short or talk yourself out of something that could end up being a good fit. I do have got plenty. So you mentioned doing a postdoc, and I think I saw on our question board there this postdoc or not to postdoc question. So do you feel like your postdoc did help you kind of move in the direction you wanted to? Were there things you got out of it that you couldn't have gotten out of your graduate training? And do you recommend postdocs when people ask you that question?
So I'm going to actually, this is one of those questions I think is very easy to say, oh, it depends, right? And I remember I was actually asked by somebody from a consulting agency during a job interview, what was the biggest career regret you've ever had? And my answer was, I did a postdoc. So you guys could, so there's Emily pointing at me, but so I think you guys might know how I feel about that. And part of it was because I really felt like a lot of the transferable skills for me I had already had in place. And maybe I wasn't, all the postdoc did for me, and this is not a small all, but is that it gave me time to continue to develop it, and maybe what it did was it made me look back at them a little bit harder than I would have. It bought me extra time for reflection, and mostly because I think I was slightly miserable in my postdoc without realizing it. And so it forced me into that position where I started thinking about about why I'm continuing to do this. And I would also say that because of that time, and because I was fortunate to have done a postdoc in New York, I started volunteering at the American Museum of Natural History, and as a way to sort of understand what life was like outside of the museum, right? Or outside of academia. And that's one of the, so what the postdoc got me was sort of like geographic convenience.
That's not a thing.
Which is not a bad idea. You could always take a postdoc somewhere to put yourself in a place you might want to try out, right?
Yeah. I think I'll just say that like my postdoc experience is pretty different. So I knew really early on, probably like halfway through grad school, that I would probably not pursue tenure track roles unless there was something really specific that seemed like a fit. So I kind of took postdocs as an opportunity to retrain. So I postdoced in a school of education that was partnered with the AMNH, so I was also there. And then I also did a postdoc at the University of Colorado on their science education initiative, and they were both kind of really great places to build education research or social science skills. So I think if you know that you want to build some extra skills and there's some postdocs available that could help you, there's also industry postdocs and museum postdocs and other types of placements that might get you closer to having industry-ready experience. So I wouldn't say rule it out, but use it wisely as a tool rather than just maybe kind of continuing on that path because it's expected of you.
So you have a title that I think is very familiar to people in the museum space and maybe a little bit less obvious to people outside of that. Can you describe, I'm curious, like, if you described a little bit about what you do and the nature of your work, what is it about your personality that makes you good at it and makes you enjoy it?
That's a great question. So I think that lead content developer so I have kind of the two titles up there, lead content developer and curator, and they're both really about researching and writing things for a public audience. And they kind of work with different content sets. In this case, they're slightly different, but they're really about being able to take in and synthesize a lot of sort of information from the primary literature and turn it into like a cohesive, easy to understand narrative that usually is kind of written at or below the 8th grade level. And so I think I really like teaching. I like people. I'm like a pretty chatty and informal person, and I think that maybe sort of was a leg up in pursuing those types of roles. I also just really get a kick out of organizing information so that it's intuitive and easy to uptake, and that gives me like great satisfaction when I feel like I've sequenced like information really well for people and kind of built something that's going to logically take them to where they need to go. So I think that that sort of desire really helps in these types of roles too.
Do you have a superpower?
Superpower. Yeah, I would say like taking information, big, messy information, and making it into a sort of relatively cohesive narrative is what I'm working towards as a superpower. Do you have a superpower?
I think my superpower might be like shamelessness. I was actually thinking about it. I know it sounds weird, but a lot of my job actually involves like cold calling people, or like, you know what Lex was talking about, the third order people on LinkedIn? Yeah, I'll pick up the phone and I'll call you and surprise you, or accidentally run into you at your coffee shop because I might have been stalking you very gently. But I do think like that's, I consider myself inherently an introvert, but my job requires me to do this, right? And over the years, having developed kind of a thick skin around it, it means that I'm really good at asking people for stuff, which is handy because part of my job is also fundraising. So thinking about like bottom line up front kind of positioning when you're doing the interview request, I get to go from like, hey, how's it going? Oh, how many kids do you have? Do you have $500,000 that you would like to contribute to this particular cause that I happen to be working on today? And I think like there's a little bit of that, like, you can't be embarrassed, I guess, when people are like, yeah, no.
Nice. Sort of on a sort of related note, like this new job I think is a little slightly different than some of your previous roles. And you've actually mentioned that you've had a couple jobs since your postdoc. So how have you known when it's time to move on? How have you known when you feel ready to launch, or you're missing something that you kind of seek elsewhere?
I think there's two things. One is when I start noticing the rinse and repeat, right? I am not learning anything new anymore. I am not developing new skills. The organization has essentially saturated in terms of its abilities to support me as a growing individual or a growing professional. That's one thing. And the other is I look for that moment where you come into the job, they're going to talk to you a lot about their plans, right? This is all the hopes and dreams we have for this role. And then there's a point when you're like, we are not even coming close to these hopes and dreams that you have laid out for me. And I think that's an important moment for me, is to look for that inflection point. And then once you identify, well, at least once I identify that inflection point, I look to see, all right, in the next 6 months, if you sort of addressed it, is there going to be additional resources put towards what I want to accomplish, or what I've laid out for you as what we should be achieving, right? Presumably you're spending money on me because you thought we could get some stuff done. And you're still spending money on me, but we're not getting anything done. And that means that we're not a good fit for each other. And this is actually Sarah's very polite way of asking me, oh my God, why have you had like 4 jobs in 6 years?
That's not what I was asking. I wish I was
no filter thing
enough to go. Yeah, and I think that's something that you could flag is like there's the kind of conventionalism is like 2 years in a job, but in some industries like tech, people turn it over heck fast, and it's going to really vary by like your particulars of your industry, the particulars of your social network, like what's normal. Like I was in my last role for almost 5 years, and when I told some people in academia that I'd switched, they were like, oh, is everything okay? I'm fired. I was not. In fact, I still freelance for them. They still like me. I still like them. But I was just wanted some new experiences and new challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally not checking my phone, it's just that I kept my
Oh, yeah.
my questions on them. Speaking of changing jobs and sort of thinking about next steps, what do you feel like is the biggest trade-off in your job that you're making right now? In terms of either personal life, other career goals?
Yeah, so actually this is a trade-off that I expect to like experience for the rest of my life is like, so a lot of the fun jobs where you make stuff don't actually like pay necessarily living wage. So like writing labels for a museum kind of tops out around the level that a high school teacher makes around their third year. And teachers are commuting in Oakland, so they are going to be getting more money every year while I'll be kind of stuck. And so I think I'm kind of moving up the ranks where I'm managing groups of people that make things, and so I don't get to do as much of the making myself, and that can be a little bit of a bummer. I still have some projects where I'm doing more hands-on work, but less of that, and I think I can maybe expect to have to make that decision again and again as I try to move forward in my career.
What do you like about managing people, and what don't you like? Is there anything you like about managing people?
So I don't officially manage anyone as my direct report, which is like I think less of a thing in academia, less sort of the idea of supervisors and direct reports. But I do kind of manage the functions of a team, and I did that somewhat at the museum too. I think when you're all working together and ideas are kind of flying and people are kind of iterating on each other's work, and there's a strong relationship, then it can be just this like really fun and really engaging dynamic. And I think when that's not happening and people are really like wedded to ideas that they can't let go of, or people are like set in their ways, and then it can just feel like a drag, and you can feel like you're having 3 meetings a week to accomplish the same thing, and you get it back where you started. And so I think that that kind of it's really about the quality and sort of dynamic of your team that makes it like a joy or not a joy. What about you?
Managing people?
Yeah, you've managed a few.
A few. Oh my God.
What did you learn in your first experiences managing people? Like, what are some takeaways? I actually want to know this. My own learnings.
I think that thick skin piece, they're gonna hate you, right? Some subsection of some, they're just gonna like resent you for the fact that you think they should get off the beach, put shoes on, and come to work, right? That's the whole thing. And I think like it's really hard to give feedback, actually. And I would say that was something that I had to learn as a manager. So at one point I was managing the front of house staff, so the people that we were hiring at minimum wage, many of whom came from like backgrounds very different to the curatorial staff, for example, or the sort of director level. And so their work experience, their life experience, very different from a lot of the people that I was interacting with more, my peers. And so so at the front of house staff, I had their managers, and then I had their managers, right? And so the different tiers of management and then making sure that information is cascading properly, that concerns are actually coming back to you, and that people knew how to come to you when they had issues with their managers, and then being able to actually weigh all those things objectively without letting the whole frustration of, there are 45 people currently complaining to me about something, and realizing that you can't make 45 people happy.
It sounds very overwhelming.
And that was a hard lesson to learn, because I think some people are much more interested in feedback, and some people are more willing to act on feedback, and then some people will fight you, right? And so there's a sliding scale before you can sort of think about, or I thought about it as, there's a scale, who can I move on that scale, and then how do I deal with the people that I know will always be resisting whatever it is that I try to work out for them. And being able to go home and sleep at night, that was, right, while you're realizing you're disappointing a lot of people, that was a challenge. Right?
Yeah, that's, I think being unpopular is and I heard this from lots of managers, it's like a thing to adjust to in time. What do you feel like is the difference between the way feedback filters through in academia versus in the sort of more standard corporate workplace or nonprofit workplace?
Or nonprofit workplace. I think academia for me is a lot more straightforward. It can be a little more blunt. And one of the things is in our program, we actually teach feedback. There's a book called Thank You for the Feedback, which I would encourage those of you who might be considering moving outside of academia to read, just because it does have some good tips and sort of perspectives on the kind of feedback that you might get in a workplace. So we work on that pretty hard in our program, but that doesn't mean that we always practice what we preach, it turns out. And I think like in the nonprofit, like you had already alluded to it, right? This idea that everything requires buy-in and consensus from about 26 individuals at any given time, and only 24 of them actually need to be in that meeting. And so how do you make sure they feel heard, but still be able to identify the project and how it can move forward? And that's I think that's a skill. That, and I have no idea how to practice this, so if any of you in the audience have an idea of how to practice this, we would love to hear about it. That was like a non-answer. But
No, I think it's a good answer. I think that it's true, like getting buy-in from people is a way bigger part of your life outside of academia, and making sure that people who have the power to like fund your work or to, you know, publicize it through the media understand why what you're doing is important, and that you're kind of addressing the concerns that they have. And I think that was something that academia didn't necessarily prepare me super well to do. I would kind of just continue to argue stuff on the merits that I felt like it had, rather than being like, well, okay, you're worried it won't work for elementary school audiences. I can think about how I can kind of integrate some feedback and make it work for your team as well. So I think that was like a good thing that I had to learn. And now that I'm back on a team that's part academic, part sort of salaried staff, I see those parts of the team communicating in really different ways about feedback, and sometimes it can be a little like hairy.
it's like ships in the night sometimes. And and I would say that was actually the hardest thing for me when I first left my postdoc to join this like team that was designers, and it was operations people, it was shipping people, and it was sales staff and our CFO, right? The hardest thing for me to learn was actually, this isn't my project anymore. And I think like in evolution and ecology, we tend to have a lot of autonomy over our individual research projects, and to move from I get to control every aspect of this and how the experimental design works and when I want to come into work to do it, to now I have 27 people whose feelings I need to kind of take into account. That was actually a more abrupt transition than I thought it would be at the time.
Yeah, that sounds accurate.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock
Yeah,
just a
do you
little bit.
have one or two more that you?
I've got one more.
Okay, I got one more for you as well.
You're on LinkedIn,
I
right?
am.
What's the weirdest job that LinkedIn has ever recommended for you, and why? Why do you
Oh,
think they got it? Like
wow.
their algorithm is really kind of interesting to me, but I'm curious why you think they might have recommended that.
I don't know about weirdest. I get a lot of like data science-y stuff. I think just because I have a PhD that's like quantitative, and I think I have experimental design in my skills. So I guess there's never been anything that out there. Some kind of like business analyst stuff I get sometimes. What about you? Who can answer?
Mine is terrible. Apparently, they think that I should be in charge of air traffic control at Raleigh-Durham International
You're
Airport.
very calm.
So those of you who are based out of Raleigh, get excited.
Yeah, strap in. One of my questions is, what are some like myths about outside academia jobs that you'd like to just destroy right now?
Oh my god.
Or like, what do you wish people knew? Like, if you had one takeaway for people, what would you want them to know as they kind of like embark on this journey?
But there's no perfect job, I guess. I think that's probably really obvious. But to the point that was made earlier, I think, the career exploration thing, you're going to be doing this hopefully the rest of your life, actually. And it's not like a tenure job position or tenure track job where you could potentially settle into it, right? But be prepared to be always looking and always looking for opportunities, unless you're a very different person than I think a lot of us are. I was also almost going to kick this off by asking Sarah kind of a question that's weirdly creepy and medical,
Don't do it.
which is like, it just sounds that way. It's not. But it's kind of like, do you remember the date of your last informational interview?
Oh, yeah. Well, but I do actually.
Girls know what I'm asking about.
Yeah, well, it actually happened when I was starting my new job, and someone who had interviewed with a postdoc with years and years ago saw that I had arrived at Berkeley and asked me to come for coffee with her, and she talked about it. She's the director of the paleontology museum there, and so we had a really good coffee. And then I got an interview from another person. So my last contact of an informational interview was actually from someone who wanted to interview me. Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah, and I would just say be open to these things,
Mhm.
right? And, you know, if you're somebody whose job sounds interesting to you, call them. Be shameless.
Be shameless.
Do we have a few minutes for
I
questions?
think so, yeah.
Yeah,
Do
we
you guys
wanted
wanna
to
take
leave a
some?
few minutes. We saw that you guys had submitted a lot of great questions, and we tried to cover them a little bit. And then we also, if you have more questions that we don't get to, please do submit them using your Post-it notes and Sharpies, because as we think about this going forward, we want to continue to build programs that can be helpful to the audience that might be interested in this. And I think, like, for example, right, one of the questions that was submitted was about federal jobs and how do you find a job in the government. I will say that I've been a federal employee. I think some other people have. Vivian here has been a federal contractor, so find us later if you specifically want to talk about those things. But are there any other questions you guys might want to ask since we're just hanging out up here?
You touched briefly on freelancing, and I have some friends, and they just seem to pick these things up, and they kind of come out of nowhere. Is this like, is it a different kind of ball game? Is it something that people should be looking into as well, or is this just part and parcel with the whole everything that we've been talking about?
So yeah, I freelance for my former employer, and that's I think a way a lot of people end up in freelancing life. I think it's sort of unusual depending on your field, and people freelance in all kinds of fields. But it's sort of unusual to just jump feet first into freelancing. Like very often, like say you're a designer, you're working with clients through your employer, and then you eventually kind of branch out and they hire you, for small projects. And they usually say like it's helpful to have a 9-to-5 or a day job while you're building a freelance career. So I do my work for my old employer on top of my work for my new employer, which can sometimes feel a little crazy, but it's like worth it because I like both the jobs. And then in that time, I've kind of, both when I was a grad student now, sometimes if I see someone who's cool, I'll shoot them an email and be like, hey, I really like your work. Do you need any help with X, Y, and Z? But I've never been a full-time freelancer, and that's like kind of a whole different skill set because it's like hustling clients, like your taxes and your finances are totally different. And so like if you're gonna go that route, I would do, that's like a whole other session. So like go research that with like a real freelancing expert guru type.
So I'm
Right
a full-time freelancer.
Sorry.
You'll get to meet with Vivian later too, yeah.
Do you want to expand on that? Like we don't want to speak for you.
No, I mean, I think a lot of what you said was accurate. So I started out as a full-time writer at a contracting company, and then I went to NIH and wrote for a couple of different NIH institutes, and then went to HHMI and was a writer there for a little while. Then I got married to an active duty military physician, so we moved to San Antonio, and so I became full-time freelance at that point. But during my time at the NIH, I had started freelancing very much like part-time and sort of building a client base. And now that I'm full-time freelance in San Antonio, I still get about half of my work from the NIH. So yeah, your former employers often become freelance clients, like similar to what Sarah did.
When you guys made the decision to leave academia, did you ever question whether you had like the training to do whatever job it was? You spent so much time training for, like experimental design, lab work, computational biology, whatever it is. But then when you made that switch, was it scary, or like did you question like, oh man, like do I have these abilities or this training to do whatever type of position it is?
I think that maybe I just expected to learn a lot on the job, and I think that that's like a normal expectation for almost every job, and so I maybe felt like I was a little further behind than I wanted to be, but that I was just kind of expected to be learning on the job for the rest of my life, and I might as well start now. What about you?
You were a lot more calm and collected. I didn't sleep for like 4 weeks. Mostly because there was a question that came up during that first interview where the woman who would eventually become my boss asked me, you have a PhD in evolutionary biology. How are you ever going to do sales? fair question. But I think like that's that transferable skills, right? How far out can you push the way you think about what you learned during your PhD? And the answer that I gave her was, well, think about every single grant that I've had to write, think about every single talk you're gonna give at meetings like this, and every committee meeting, right? You're trying to get somebody to buy your narrative, your story, your data. And I didn't see it too differently from that, which was like, I think an answer that was effective. But yeah, after I accepted the offer, I didn't sleep for weeks because I had no idea how to sell museum content. And that's that other piece, which is the research piece. You learn a lot on the job, and then you're also extremely good at research. One could say you guys are the world's experts on research now, right? And so you're really good at doing things like identifying potential clients. If you learn how to use LinkedIn well, you can be really good at sales, obviously. And I use every functionality that LinkedIn allows me even to this day because I'm always looking for the person that could help me kind of achieve some of those metrics and the sales goals that I have, or the fundraising goals, or the marketing goals that I have, right? So, and who's really good at following data around, right? Biologists. But yeah, it's scary, but you'll learn because you're smart and you're curious and you know how to do the hardest part of the job in many ways.
I just wanted to say something too. You mentioned that you volunteered, and I think that's a really good experience to have, just getting out and like trying your skills at something else too, because you might have these skills and you just don't realize you do yet.
Yeah, I think I also volunteered before applying things. I still volunteer places. Yep.
How did you get help to write your resume or application for the job, that going from evolutionary biology to a museum or analyst or?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of getting help on your resume, whether that's from like a friend who knows really, the ins and outs of hiring, like a friend who works in HR. Like I think Lex mentioned, there's career centers. Some of the bigger universities will have someone who works with grad students and postdocs. So you might be able to get some specialized help translating that CV to a resume. And then if those resources aren't working out for you, there are people who kind of do resume consulting. And it's kind of a mixed bag, but if you can find someone who specializes in like academic CV translation, that can sometimes be really helpful because the conventions really are like noticeably different when you're writing a CV versus a resume. So it's really helpful, I think, to just get the lowdown from someone who does this all the time.
Ooh, a quick plug for the booth tomorrow too. We'll have, I don't know exactly who's going to be there, but I'll be there. And several, I think Vivian, bring your resume if you want, someone in a particular area to have a look at it. Tomorrow during the poster session, bring it on like your laptop or something, and we can suggest edits.
Yeah. And like go on LinkedIn and read lots of people's resumes and see what you like and don't like about them, right?
And through LinkedIn, you can find someone in your network who's in a similar position. They might not be hiring, but if you know them, ask them, can you take a look at my resume? Are there things I'm missing? Like, we hire people for this kind of role. Are there things that I'm missing? What would you look for? We've had several of those requests over the years, and we will provide you like really good feedback. It might not be looking, but we'll tell you like, actually be more specific. How much did you improve the organization's product in this time? What did you improve, right? And that's free consulting. Okay. So use that LinkedIn.
I think that should be it, unless anyone has one more question. I'll check for that. You guys get snacks.
And then you guys can get snacks and we'll hang out and we can talk about
Yeah.
over
You have a chance to
snacks.
talk to everyone who's spoken so far and a bunch more people who haven't later, so.
Let's do, we're a little off, but it's okay. Let's do 10 minutes and try to we'll meet back at 5 to 3, and we'll carry on from there. Sound good? There's various snacks and coffee, and thanks. Is that guy recording?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start off. I'm not going to ask people to identify themselves as introverts. Because I kind of already know, having been in science for a long time, that a lot of people consider themselves introverts. So just a little background on myself here.
That has a funny pointer. How are you guys with the volume? There is a mic if we want.
Yeah, I'll try to speak up, but
Okay.
if I need to.
Oh my. Oh, I think you got to click.
I got to present.
Yeah, you got it.
Where does the advance on this?
try that arrow keys. Gotcha.
Got it. All right. So, a little background on myself. I went to undergraduate in Worcester as a biotechnology and an English major, which is somewhat relevant to what we'll be talking about later. I went to the University of North Carolina, where I got my PhD in genetics and biology, in molecular biology. Did a postdoc at Harvard. My postdoc was also not the highlight of my career, but I'm not going to talk about that too much today. And after I left my postdoc, I started working at Adgene. At that point, Adgene had only been around for a few years. I was about its 7th or 8th employee. And I was essentially, my title was senior scientist, but I really did a little bit of everything, wear a lot of hats in the nonprofit world, particularly when we are essentially a startup at the same time. And over the years, I've actually been at Adgene for 11 years now, which is a long time. But the reason I've stayed there is because my job has changed and evolved a lot. And I'm now the director of product management there. So a big part of my position is being a cross-team communicator and talking to people on our business team and our software development team, basically all the teams, and I'm kind of the person who's the communication hub for our cross-team projects. So when I was in graduate school and a postdoc, I was very much focused on my technical training. I wanted to know, as this says, when I thought about networking, it wasn't even something I did think about, honestly. I could manipulate DNA and protein, I could do all sorts of assays, and that's what I was focused on my career, was that technical expertise, which was, in hindsight, pretty naive. As I moved through Adgene and started becoming more of a cross-team communicator, I really had to go back to my undergraduate days where WPI happens to have a very team-based, project-based program. So all of my projects that I did at WPI were team-based. And I also went back, believe it or not, to my English degree, where I really realized that communication was one of the things I needed to focus on. So it wasn't just the technology, I was really thinking about writing and communicating, and the English really came into play there. And so now, as I was learning over the years, networking wasn't something I could ignore. It was something I had to embrace. I didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Because really my career, or this new phase of my career, where I was becoming this cross-team communicator and talking to a lot of people outside of science, really necessitated me being able to talk to people from different backgrounds across many different platforms, not just science. But there's a problem, which is I really think that networking sucks, or at least my narrow definition of what I thought networking was. So this is literally just taken off Shutterstock when I Googled networking event. Going to these things, really, I dreaded them. For years, I was forcing myself to go to these things that called themselves networking events. And I would literally break out into a cold sweat walking into the room. I hated it. And when you walk into a situation like that thinking, okay, I'm going to go network and talk to strangers, and you're dreading any minute of it, there's no way you're going to be able to do it effectively and really create real relationships. It took me a long time to get to the point that when I realized that this was not my bag. This is not to say that networking events don't work for some people. It just realized that they don't work for me. And I know a lot of other scientists who also dread those experiences. So basically, I had to think about how I could get networking to work for me and my personality and the way that I interact with people. So the first thing I stopped doing was going to networking events. Not that I never go to them, but I generally do avoid going to things that bill themselves exclusively as networking events, because I just find them awkward. So other things that I considered my new networking events were conferences, workshops like this, poster sessions, seminars, things that I was doing anyway. And then even outside of the realm of my professional life, I started thinking about sports teams that I was involved in, meetups. my PTA has become a big part of my network. Just like other parents on the playground, like those social interactions have actually become really important to me. So I started kind of moving my context a little bit. So that was kind of my rule one. And these guidelines that I'm talking about today, they're pretty just things that I have picked up and realized along the way as I tried to figure out what networking meant to me. So this was the first one where I just kind of avoided those types of events. And Lex talked about this a little bit, but the other thing that I really started thinking about is focusing on the quality of my contacts over the quantity. So I do know people who are super networkers, and they have those millions or hundreds and hundreds of contacts, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. I just realized that it wasn't working for me, because I'll go through, and this goes back to my days when I was forcing myself to go to networking events, I'll go through my early contacts on LinkedIn and realize that I have no idea who those people are or why I know them anymore. That's not useful to me as a contact, or at least in terms of my style of networking. So what I did instead is started focusing on the people that I did remember, and really people who, if I see their faces, I know exactly how I got to know them, I know what they do. And so those are the people that I really started focusing on. So instead of going for quantity, I really started focusing on the people that I wanted to maintain a network with. So the other thing that helped me, and I realized this is not going to be a solution for everybody, was really looking at social media. So Lex talked about LinkedIn a little bit, so I'm going to talk about Twitter. A lot of people have a fairly visceral reaction to Twitter. It is a land of trolls, and some really terrible, terrible things can be on there. I tend to stick to science Twitter, which many of you might know, it's a real thing. Not that science Twitter can't get ugly, but it's not as bad as other parts of that social media platform. And what I really started to do over the years, over the last couple of years, is turn Twitter into my icebreaker. And what I mean by that is, when I go to conferences and meetings, as part of my job at Agene, because we're a very broad platform looking at all different types of science, when I go to meetings, I could go to a stem cell meeting one year, a couple months later I'll go to a chromatin meeting, go to an evolution meeting. So I don't know, when I go to these big meetings, I don't know a single person. So for me to be able to walk up to a complete stranger cold is very intimidating for me. I don't enjoy it, I never have. But what I found is when I went on Twitter and started, because I enjoy writing, and if I was engaging at that conference with speakers or other people that were commenting on the speakers, replying to their tweets, that kind of thing, I found that I could use that initial social media interaction to really help me approach them in person later on to initiate a conversation. So I've literally gone up to people and say, hey, thanks for replying to my tweet, or I really like what you said about this and that gives me just enough confidence to be able to walk up to people if I've had that sort of virtual interaction there, to walk up to them in person and initiate a conversation. It doesn't always work, but it's really been a game changer for me. And I would say for the last 2 or 3 years, this has been my in at a lot of the meetings that I go to, is to use Twitter to do that. And there are other platforms besides Twitter. A lot of conferences have their own apps. I have to say, Keystone conferences, I don't know if any of you have been to those. They tend to have their own apps with their own social media. Nobody uses them as far as I can tell. Twitter seems to be the one that's most popular. But that's been a big game changer for me in terms of how I network with people. The other important thing that I've come to realize over the years is just maintaining, having that initial point of contact is not going to be enough to really count that person as in your network. You have to maintain those contacts, and sometimes that level of maintenance is completely up to you. So I'm just going to walk through a couple scenarios here of real life situations where how I met some people and how I've maintained contact. So Jessica is somebody I met at a large Boston non-profit bio group years ago, almost 6 years ago. A few years later, we ended up at a Keystone meeting together. She was in pharma at that point. She left the nonprofit world. But I recognized her, and that was enough for me to introduce and say, hey, we met a couple years ago, and we ended up basically kind of being conference buddies. Since then, because she's a person who has a lot of interesting jobs and has changed jobs a couple of times over the years, I've really made a point of staying in contact with her. I would say every 6 months or so, I'll say, hey, can we grab a coffee? Can we go out for lunch? And we just catch each other up on what each other are doing. And sometimes, a couple times, I've recommended, so we're both in positions where we hire people. So sometimes she'll push a candidate towards me. Sometimes I'll push one towards her. And so we've exchanged those types of contacts over the years, and it's been really beneficial. So Omar is somebody who I met probably about 4 years ago. So part of my role at Agene, which is, should have given a little more background for those who aren't familiar with Agene, we're a plasmid repository, a nonprofit plasmid repository. So part of my job for years was to go to academic labs and ask them to give us their DNA plasmids. And so Omar was somebody in a fairly prevalent lab in the genome engineering world. For those of you who are familiar with CRISPR technology, Omar was in Feng Zhang's lab at the Broad Institute. And I worked with him on deposited Agene for several years. And we started following each other on Twitter. And again, it's another way to use that platform as what you would call probably a loose touch form of maintenance. So whenever he had some paper come out, I would send him congratulations and that kind of thing. And really, this just literally happened this last week. Omar reached out to me and said, hey, I'm graduating. I'm starting my own lab. We've worked together for a couple of years. Could you help me get kind of a discount on my next round of plasmid, on my first round of plasmids, because I don't have very much startup money. And so that was something that I could do for him. I was able to, that was something that I could offer him. And I was happy to do that because we had stayed in contact. And in exchange, he and I are talking right now about him being interviewed for our blog because he has a very unique situation where he works very closely with another graduate student from the same lab, and they're starting their lab together. And it's a completely 50-50 collaborative lab where they'll be applying to grants with each other. And so we'll be talking to him about an interview about how a collaborative lab works. So there's some tip for that there for sure, but I was really happy that we've been able to maintain that contact over the years. And then in a much more long-term scenario, there's a picture of me in 2001 at the Lineberger Cancer Center at UNC when I had hair, but still sporting the same sideburns. So this was, 18 years ago. This is one of my best friends from graduate school, Carrie. We worked in the same lab. Carrie ended up leaving early with a master's, but we stayed in touch over the years. He stayed down south, I moved back up north. And then this past summer of last year, Carrie said, I need to get out of the south. And Boston is looking pretty good. He came to visit for the summer. And he sent me what kinds of jobs he was looking for. So he kind of moved away from science a little bit and had been taking some business classes and data analysis. And so he said, hey, if you see anything that looks interesting, let me know. And literally a month later, our director of business operations, or our business development director came to me and said, hey, we really need somebody who can analyze data, and it would be great if they had a science background as well. And I said, well, I know a guy. So long story short, after 18 years, one of my best friends is now working side by side with me again at Agene. And it was really a mutual, besides the fact that he got the kind of job he wanted, and it was a real career shift from what he was doing, Agene has already, he's only been there for 4 or 5 months now, and I've already had directors tell me that they're not sure what we had done without him, because he's really filled that role perfectly. And that's an extreme example, but I think one of the things I want to drive home, and Lex touched upon this a little bit with his LinkedIn, is that those close contacts, so the people in the lab, at the bench next to you, or your closest collaborators, you know, those are really important parts of your network. So if you don't, you know, you never know when you're going to want to call in a favor with somebody, so maintain those contacts even when you leave the lab or whatever your situation is. You know, the other thing that I would say is, in terms of maintenance, I would say 25 to 30% of my contacts on LinkedIn are coworkers from AdGene, so people I've worked with over the years. And I would consider them, even though they're my coworkers and some of them I see every day, I still consider them part of my network, and it's a very valuable part of my network. So just, those are relationships that you want to try to maintain when you can. So a really big thing that it took me a while to realize is that networking is not just for job seekers. So there's a lot of reasons to network. And this was a big leap for me when people first told me about how networking is important, because I'm sure many people in this room have heard it's not about what you know, it's about who you know, and I think that that is legitimately true. So when you are looking for jobs, you really have to think about who your contacts are, but if that is your sole reason to try to network, you're going to have, it's a little intimidating to go in and just think that that's why you're doing it. So I want to talk a little bit about other ways that I've used my networks. So one is just speaking gigs, basically. So these are just a couple places I've talked. I've spoke with people in the last couple of years. I spoke at Pitt about scientists working in nonprofits. I spoke on a career panel at Penn State. I've spoken at the Boston Postdoc Association about cross-team communication across different platforms. And this is my son's middle school. I've given genome engineering talks to 8th graders because they were looking for somebody who had some expertise in that area. And I was like, sure, why not? I'll teach 8th graders, which that was really ridiculous of me to think it was going to be that easy. It was a really fun experience, and I'll do it again, but it was a lot of work. But it was just a cool opportunity, and I did that. The person who got me it was the parents of one of my daughter's friends at daycare were 8th grade science teachers there. And so I struck up a conversation with them, and we basically came together to say this was a good match for them. So I've got a lot of opportunities to do that, and it was pretty much all through first and second degree networks. The other thing that I've done, which might not be the most relevant thing to the people in this room right now, are hiring for hard-to-fill positions. So you've already met my friend Carrie, but all these other people at AdGene, Daniela is our CTO, Angela, I did my postdoc with it. Angela and I did postdocs together. She's now one of our main curators of our DNA collection. So I helped her bring her into AdGene. So all the people here have filled very difficult to fill positions, and they didn't apply for the job really. We reached out to them, or people at AdGene reached out to them and asked them to come on board, and it was really fortunate that we were able to do that. So the other thing that I use my network for sometimes are just for collaborations and niche expertise, and this is something that I think people in this room could start thinking about. So Steven is a guy, he's kind of what I would call a super networker. He's one of these people who knows everybody in the Boston biotech scene, and I've bumped into him at a couple things. So we struck up a conversation at a fundraiser one day, and I mentioned that AdGene was looking for somebody who knew about bioinformatics. We deal with a lot of bioinformatic data, and he's like, I know a guy. And he ended up giving me a name, we contacted him, and this person has been coming in and consulting with us for bioinformatics for about half a year now. So these are nice people to try to get into your network if you have them. I have 2 or 3 of them, the people who know people, and that's how you get to those second degree networks. So Doug is the head of the Harvard Imaging Center, and I was just doing a tour one day of the Harvard Imaging Center, and he was telling me about what he did and that he liked AdGene. I was like, hey, sounds like you know a lot about stuff. So, he's clearly an expert in microscopy. And I said, would you mind writing a chapter of our Fluorescent Proteins 101 ebook? And he did. It took a while to get to that point where there was some back and forth for a while, but he wrote a full chapter of our book for free. We're a nonprofit. We don't pay people to do this, but he did it because he wanted the exposure, and he knew that he could do it well. And we don't sell this ebook. This is all free stuff. So, but he was able to do that, and it's become very popular. Both the ebook itself and the chapter that he wrote are one of our most accessed articles that we have. And then there's Leah, who I met at a meeting a couple of years ago. She was a person I did not actually talk to face-to-face when I was at the meeting, but we started corresponding via Twitter. That turned into an email correspondence. And then when I told her that I was writing a blog post, so Leah also happens to be, she's a scientist, but she's also an artist. And I asked her if she would mind illustrating some of my blog posts. And so rather than just take generic pictures or rip them off the internet, which is how I usually take things, I actually had an artist create unique illustrations for the blog post. So that was pretty cool. And that gave her some exposure, because she sells some of her print site. Recommend checking out her site sometime. So that was just another way of using that network for a new skill. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but really what I want people to think about is redefining what you think of as your network. So I've already talked about Carrie. Another person that I went to graduate school with was Hutton, who is now the director of the genomics laboratory at the Mayo Clinic. I haven't actually asked her for any favors. She hasn't asked me for any, but it's somebody who I want to be in contact with because she's a good person to know. She gives TED Talks on genomics, and she's a really smart person, and I would hate to lose contact with her. Kayla is somebody who used to work at Adgene. This is very up to date because I really just had breakfast with Kayla 2 days ago, and we have a new job position where she left Adgene because she wanted to become a computer programmer. She was basically administrative assistant, but she was really, really good at it. One of the smartest people who's come through our doors. And so she went, took a crash course in Python, and I said, well, it just so happens that we have a position on my team that would require some Python expertise. So she's coming in next week, and fingers crossed she'll help us fill that position, because she has not only the new coding experience, but she has the institutional knowledge that will really help her hit the ground running if she does come back. Other people I mentioned, getting to know people through my kids, and I realize that not everybody here can relate to that, but you have other social things. Alex happens to be my daughter's best friend's mom, and she's a director of communications at a science institute. Katie is somebody who I met at the PTA. She translates Spanish, and I'm probably going to be reaching out to her sometime in the next year to translate some of our web pages. It's somebody who I can literally just talk to on any day, who has a unique skill that it's much easier to go to somebody you know than to go searching, just cold calling people. And then I'm just going to tell a quick story here about how contacts of contacts of contacts can work out. So this is just an example of how networking can kind of fall together. So Tyler used to be an outreach scientist at Adgene. He's since moved to the West Coast, but he was there for a while. And a couple of years ago, he introduced me to Sarah. I know Lenny knows Sarah. She's another super networker. A lot of people also know her. So Sarah is the one who got me the speaking opportunity at the Boston Postdoc Association, so I got to know her. And during that event, she introduced me to Sweta, who honestly, I didn't remember who Sweta was. She's not a person who I would consider a first contact, but she emailed me pretty much out of the blue a couple of months ago and said, hey, we met at this event, and I have somebody who would like to talk to someone at Adgene. So she introduced me to Sarah, who this is like 3 degrees of separation at the time. As you can see, I consider her a contact now. But she was also in science communications. She wanted to come in for an informational interview, so she came in and we talked for about 4 to 5 minutes. And as it turns out, Sarah is an advocate for scientists with hearing disabilities. She herself is deaf. And I said, well, it's funny you should say that because we also have an employee at Gene, Lucy, who has a hearing disability. She gave this amazing talk to our organization about where she talked about how she's moved through her career, like what her disability means to her, what she's done. And Sarah was blown away that Lucy actually stood up in front of our entire organization and gave this talk. So I connected the two of them, and now they're in touch so that Sarah can learn about how Lucy told her story to her work about her specific disability. So this weird chain of events happened. And then incidentally, Lucy was hired because she was a board member's dentist's daughter. So that's just another weird contact of contact kind of thing. But this was like when I really sat down to think about what my network has done for me, I realized that there's a lot of these connections that happen. And then finally, my last guideline here is one way to really start off networking that I think helps is before you start asking and taking advice, try offering and giving instead. Because I find that as an introverted person, it's much easier for me to say, hey, can I help out with that, than say, hey, can you help me with that? So doing that first step of like just offering something, don't expect anything in return. I don't when I offer to do these things. Just kind of put it out there because it's an easy thing to do. So if down the road you do have something to ask, it's going to be much easier if you've already established that this is something, a relationship that you've established. So I find that giving first helps a lot. So finally, if you're worried about how to network or when to start, I would say don't worry, because you're really already doing it. There's a bit of a context switch there. It's like if you go into a situation thinking, I'm going to network now, that's going to be hard. But if you go into a situation like this, you think everybody in this room is a potential contact right now, you're already well on your way. So I want to wrap up because I know we're behind on time, but I do want to thank the ad genies. These are all the people who've kind of taught me that these are valuable skills over the years. We have a lot of other networking and other career advice on the ad genie blog, so I encourage you to check that out. We have a whole career handbook. And also, I have a couple of my ideas were helped by Karen Wickbro's book, Taking the Work Out of Networking, which I found was a very useful resource for me. So.